One of the reasons why we call it the transatlantic slave trade is because we never put the word European and American next to slave trade.
The idea is that the British had a sort of a epiphany of consciousness sometime in the late 1800s.
It's now cobalt and coltan that's being pulled out of the Congo. Previously, it was my ancestors. It was enslaved human beings. There are many records of African Muslims enslaved in the Americas keeping their plantation records for their masters because the enslaved Muslims were literate in multiple languages and their masters couldn't read any.
What is the cause then for this sort of liberal amnesia?
The magic formula is white supremacy, believing that the people around you aren't people the way that you're people, and therefore you can do whatever you want to them. And that has always meant inflicting massive casualties on women and children in order to break down political systems. We don't have language or visuals to describe the kind of systematic trauma that is inflicted upon human beings, or maybe many in this generation didn't have it until they've seen Gaza.
What's your vision for how you kind of fix America?
Fortunately, my wife's office is 50 yards from here, so she snuck out of her office to come help us get set up also. So, because this never would have happened if I had to fix all of this myself, that's for sure.
No, I mean, alhamdulillah. Hi, good day and welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. Today, joining me again is Dr. Rudolph Ware, or Butch Ware, as we call him. Butch, good to see you again.
Good to see you as well. It's a pleasure to be back.
Yeah. I mean, we last spoke about a year ago, and I think it's before you had any machinations at all of possibly running in the U.S. elections, and as you are currently running for the governor of California. So things have changed quite a bit, not just in your life, but they've changed dramatically. I mean, we're going to discuss whether they've actually changed drastically in the U.S. or not, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, there have been dramatic changes for sure, both in my life and in the broader political environment. Some of them are, more significant than other changes. Some are just superficial changes. But yeah, it definitely was not, there were zero machinations about any kind of political interventions, aside from, the kind of organizing stuff that I was already doing. So yeah, quite a lot's changed in the last year for sure.
Okay, so I mean, we are definitely going to speak about your campaign and running for the governor of California. But I mean, I'm speaking to you mainly today in a capacity as a person of knowledge. We're going to be talking about sort of West African history, the slave trade, and how what happened there sort of informs the America that was built as a result, how that manifests itself today, and just how that also sort of has played out in global identity politics. And so, and after all of that, we'll speak about you running for your vision for America and what it means to run for the governor of California.
I mean, I'm really excited to actually be able to interact with somebody as a scholar and as an intellectual and as a historian of Islam and as a historian of Africa. It's actually nourishing all of my reads of contemporary political situations. But I think that a lot of people obviously don't know that history. So it's a great chance to be able to talk about it.
Yeah, look, it's a lot to speak about. So do take your time, but we also are going to get through quite a lot, right? So just to sort of start, when you know about like the sort of the transatlantic slave trade has been popularized to some extent in popular culture, but what do you think when you take the sort of global read on the subject matter? What do we have to unlearn about it and fundamentally understand? What was it really about, and what kind of a world did it create?
Yeah, the transatlantic slave trade is already a misnomer insofar as the Euro-American slave trade, which is what I call it in my academic work. The slave trade that was operated by Europeans and Americans, actually a quarter of it was conducted in the Indian Ocean, especially by the Dutch and the French and the Portuguese. But the trade in enslaved Africans was conducted not just in the Atlantic, but in the Indian Ocean. One of the reasons why we call it the transatlantic slave trade is because we never put the word European and American next to slave trade. It's one of those ways that you throw the rock and hide the hand when there's a slave trade from Africa into predominantly Muslim countries in the Middle East, they call it an Arab slave trade or an Islamic slave trade. But when it's Europeans that are operating it, it's euphemistically referred to as transatlantic, despite the fact that it was actually a global trade in enslaved Africans. So that's number one. Number two, people, I think, don't understand the scale of the trade. This is between 12 and 20 million Africans that were ripped from their home societies and brought into bondage just in that transatlantic component. Um, and historically speaking, this is actually the foundation of modern capitalism. This is the foundation of modern imperialism. Every institution that is at the root of our contemporary societies, its fundamental dynamics go back to the trade in enslaved human beings. I'll give you an example. Lloyd's of London, the largest insurer and bank essentially in British imperial history, gets its start insuring slave voyages. The first times the word company is used to refer to what we would think of as a corporation, we're talking about the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch West India Company, the British Royal Africa Company. These are crown corporations that operate a trade in slaves. So when it looks in today's world like these massive corporations are institutions of unmitigated evil, well, the apple don't fall too far from the tree. That's where they come from. So I think that people generally don't know the scale of it, both in terms of its numbers and in terms of its geographic reach. And they don't understand the foundational role that slavery plays in establishing the wealth of Europe and establishing early capitalism. The great Pan-Africanist historian, African descended from Guyana, Walter Rodney, wrote a brilliant book about this, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, where he has a lengthy chapter where he talks about the African slave trade the European slave trade as a basic factor in African underdevelopment. So people do not understand the relationship between the enriching of the West and the impoverishing of Africa.
Give us an extent of just what that was, the enriching of Europe and the West and the impoverishing of Africa. But also, you mentioned that it wasn't just the transatlantic slave trade. There were slaves from Africa going from the African West Coast predominantly, different parts of the world. Give us a sense of where they were going to, how many. I mean, I guess we don't know the exact numbers, but proportionately, and also sort of like what year this was, because there were many years. It happened over 2 centuries. So just like when was it accelerated, and how it? I know it's a big question, but I mean, and you don't have to answer all of it because I'll do some follow-ups. But how it? I mean, I think the big question is just how it sort of really ungrounded really the local populations.
Yeah. So we're talking about a trade that, in its legal transatlantic form, runs over 4 centuries, from 1490s, post Christopher Columbus. The first enslaved Africans are brought to the Western Hemisphere in Columbus's voyages. That European operated slave trade is not made illegal until 1886 in Cuba and 1888 in Brazil. So we're talking about 4 centuries and between 12 and 20 million people. There's all kind of metrics for the kind of destabilization that produces inside the African continent before you even get to the kind of trauma and death that it meant for the enslaved in the Americas. But one measure is that every other continental landmass has a massive increase in population across those centuries. And population growth, of course, is one of the principal factors in economic development. It's the reason why Japan is, panicking and trying to, up its birth rate and doing all kinds of things, because when you have negative population growth, it's a massive inhibitor for economic growth. So the best population historians, suggest that at the best case scenario is that Africa's population stays stagnant through that period. while global populations and therefore also global, economic indicators are rising everywhere else. So Africa is there's a dialectic relationship between the industrialization of Europe, the development of the Western world, and the impoverishment of Africa. When Walter Rodney describes this in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, he says, when you study the effects of the slave trade in Africa, he said, it immediately becomes apparent that you're not studying the effects of trade at all. You are studying the effects of massive social warfare on an impossible scale. And the reason for that is that the way that Europeans produced enslaved human beings as commodities on the African continent is through the same kind of politics of destabilization that we now see. You destabilize an environment politically by flooding it with weapons, pitting warlords against one another so that you can extract resources at low cost. The same process that allows us to have cheap iPhones because of the enslavement of Congolese children today is the same process that produced, it's now cobalt and coltan that's being pulled out of the Congo. Previously, it was my ancestors, it was enslaved human beings, but the same process of destabilization was active then. By the way, this was something that was diagnosed and resisted by African elites from the beginning, right? And as early as 1526, so barely 30 years into the transatlantic trade, there is a king of the Congo. His name is Afonso. He's a Christian convert. His father had also converted to Christianity before the slave trade became the principal means of interaction between the Portuguese and the Congolese. Afonso writes letters to the King of Portugal in 1526. He calls him my brother, the king, and he pleads with him. He says, we want in this country no more of your merchants. We want no markets for slaves or outlets for them. And he proceeds to plead with him to end this trade because he describes the destabilization that it is spreading through the Congo, that petty warlords are kidnapping people and buying guns from Europeans on credit so that they can make war and kidnap folks and destabilize the region more broadly in order to get access to international trade. And by the 1650s, 1700s, 90% of all European trade on the African continent is in enslaved human beings. That's the only thing that they're coming for. And in fact, by that period in time, the most universally accepted form of currency throughout the European world is pesa de Anda, a piece of India. And a piece of India is not a bill, it is not a coin, it is an African male between 18 and 35 with no visible defects. That is the most universally acceptable form of currency in European trade as early as the 17th century through the 18th and into the 19th.
I mean, there'd be people listening to this, and I mean, they'd say, yeah, but I mean, slavery is not new. There were the Romans practicing slavery. It was practiced in vast parts of China and India. There's the Arab trade. And they'd kind of like almost feel that yes, slavery was brutal, and it was disgusting, and it's something that we've put away 100 years ago, or so, or just a bit longer. And why are we kind of picking on the white people who enslaved? What's your response to that?
Largest forced migration in human history by a wide margin. Never a slave trade operated on such a scale or for such a length of time. And chattel slavery, the kind of slavery that the European capitalist institutions evolve, reduce human beings to commodity status and are not rooted in older forms of hierarchies and rights in human beings. This is essentially the reduction of human beings to commodities and their use as commodities. And what does that mean in this context? It means that at the height of the Atlantic slave trade in the 18th century, Caribbean colonies like Saint Domingue, which becomes Haiti, or Jamaica, are having to import entirely new batches of enslaved Africans every 2 to 3 years because they are simply working the workforce to death and replacing them with newly arrived captives. So it is, and W.E.B. Du Bois, the great African American historian, wrote about this in early in his early analysis, early part of the 20th century. He said that the while the name slavery is applied to these different sets of institutions, the form of capitalist enslavement that develops in the Western hemisphere and in the Western world is categorically different than that which preceded it. It's not to say that slavery was a piece of cake in other places or in other times, but it never reached this kind of scale, this kind of brutality. It was never uniquely racialized in any other part of the world. A lot of people will point to the so-called Arab slave trade. Research indicates that until the rise of the European slave trade, um, Black people, for example, were never a majority amongst the enslaved in Arabic speaking countries. Like even as late as the 1600s in Egypt, the majority of the enslaved are people that are coming from all around the Mediterranean, from parts of Asia, and a few from sub-Saharan Africa. What takes place with the rise of the European slave trade is that Black and slave get collapsed into a single category. So you have a racialized, commoditized chattel slavery that is at the foundation of a new form of capitalist exploitation and a new form of global imperialism. Because it's first the Spanish, then the Portuguese, then the Dutch, then the French, then the British that dominate this trade. And that is also the list of the most powerful and wealthiest imperial states in chronological order. All of them have their foundations in this new form of mass racialized subjugation.
Okay, we're gonna get to abolition soon enough and speak about sort of the myths around that. But before that, just speak to me and give me a sense of sort of the you mentioned the racialized dehumanization and how that's, I guess there was always an element of dehumanization with slavery, but it's just kind of accelerated, and what the legacy of that was, but also what was
It's racialized. It's not just accelerated, but it's also racialized. Yeah, please continue.
right.
Sorry.
Racialized, and then give me an sense of sort of the legacy of that dehumanization and how it plays out in terms of, I mean, give me like the dehumanization is not just a term. Like we kind of probably need like anecdotes or examples of how people were brutally, treated. But then also sort of what's the spiritual legacy that was taken and lost and transferred in all of this?
Yeah. How would I begin to describe the legacies of brutality? Um, I think that I would probably begin with the systematic sexual violence and systematic use of rape as a weapon of dehumanization that was undertaken by the European slave owning class. This often took place. It began in slave barracks on the West African coast, where if you go to Gorée Island now in Senegal, where I lived for many years, the apartments and the small chapel of visiting slave ship captains are literally situated on the floor above the dungeons where the enslaved were kept. People, said their prayers to the European Crusader Christian God, and then called up enslaved women from those quarters below them, and did what they would with them. That process continued on slave ships. That process continued onto slave plantations. When you talk about the fact that you literally needed to, as I mentioned before, on Caribbean islands, to replenish the slave population every few years, you are talking about people that are literally being worked to death within the span of a couple of years and then replaced with new human beings. We don't have language or visuals to describe the kind of systematic trauma that is inflicted upon human beings, or maybe many in this generation didn't have it until they've seen Gaza. If you can imagine um, uh, that kind of brutality being visited on a people, not for 19 months, not for 75 years, but for 4 centuries, then you are beginning to grasp the genocidal nature of European engagement with Africans over the 4 centuries that comprise the transatlantic trade.
Speak to me. I mean, I also want to get a sense of sort of the uprooting of community and of families, because obviously families were separated.
Yep.
Men specifically were taken away, probably never seeing people from their community. On some instances, maybe they did. But just what that impact was, and what spiritual legacy was lost in regards to that.
Yeah, the one of the most powerful books on this for me was by a late historian of Madagascar, Pierre Larson. Um, Pierre, God rest his soul, was the child of missionaries. He's a white historian, but he grew up in Madagascar, and he made it his sort of life's work to recover the history of European trauma infliction upon that society. So he actually did a demographic study of how, when the slave trade from Madagascar accelerates, that it very quickly reaches the point where no family is untouched by the loss of a loved one or a child or a parent or a relative. And the demographic impact, can be relatively, low. You can be talking about a few thousand enslaved people being shipped out off of an island like Madagascar. But when you study the web of social relations, you realize that everyone is losing someone. And this becomes, a kind of a memory of people just disappearing, a memory of, trauma and hardship and destabilization. And in East Africa, especially, we've talked a lot about West Africa so far, predominantly because for Africans in the diaspora in the West, from the U.S. through South America, the majority of the ancestral lineages come from West Africa. About 75% of the enslaved that were brought in the transatlantic trade came from a region between Senegal and Angola, so mostly from West Africa. But that still leaves 25% of people that are being brought from other parts of the continent, including Madagascar, including East Africa, and so forth in various periods. The slave trade arrives relatively late. When people talk about, slavery existed before, in point of fact, there were many parts of the African continent where no slavery existed at all until the European slave trade came. And that's something that's worth mentioning. And Walter Rodney wrote about that in his academic works. That was particularly the case in East Africa frequently. And it happened late and so fast that quite literally in the 19th century and in the early years of the 20th century, you could interview people who had seen the whole thing happen, who lived in societies that had no enslavement and had relatively mild forms of social hierarchy inside them, get suddenly raided by populations coming from the coast that are funded, and carrying European arms, and rip a society apart. And then that society puts itself back together by trying to acquire the same kind of arms to defend themselves that people use to victimize them. But the only way to acquire those European firearms is to trade in slaves. So they then go victimize neighboring populations in order to protect themselves. And leadership goes from being in the hands of people who are um, communally responsible to one another to simply people who are able to accumulate weapons and to utilize those for raid and plunder and self-defense. That process in East Africa sometimes happens within the span of a century, so that people witness the whole thing in their lifetime. And that is a process that unfolded over the course of centuries in West Africa. You have this systematic destabilization of African societies, European arms. Just to give some background for this, one historian, Joseph Inakori, did a study of the number of guns that were sold into West Africa as an index of this process of destabilization. And he showed that just from British and French sources, that there were between 350,000 and 400,000 guns per year sold into West Africa, just in the second half of the 18th century. So this is an area that, destabilization is being cultivated, and that is ripping communities apart internally. It's causing, systematic violence. It's causing people to disappear, and we still see the echoes of those forms of destabilization in the kind of contemporary politics of the Congo, or contemporary politics in Sudan. Those proxy wars of destabilization in order to facilitate resource extraction, whether it's Sudanese gold or Congolese cobalt and coltan. Those things are the direct genealogical heirs of the political economy of European slave trading in Africa. In that respect, only the commodities have changed, the dynamics have not.
I think what's interesting, just listening to what you're saying, is how the concept of the African warlord was born out of slavery, and it was born out of the fact that tribes and people and communities needed to protect their communities, and so it's desperation and a race to the bottom, and this is all because of a foreign imposed need to commodify human beings, and the local sort of impact that's taken. I think, and when you think, like, it's hard to imagine that it's that's socially disrupted a society for 400 years. And so inevitably there's so much legacy and baggage from that, which is really quite hard to fathom. Um, let's speak about abolition, right? Because I mean the idea is that the British had a sort of a epiphany of consciousness sometime in the late 1800s, and they decided to ban slavery. And they official history says that they did, and then they even sort of fought. They deployed their navy to fight slave ships. And it's interesting because at the same time, they still own most of the colonial world. They're still shattering India through plagues and everything else. And then there's all sorts of new developments that happen in the Western world. There's American War for Independence, all of those things. But just kind of how much of that do we get wrong?
Basically, the whole thing. That is, um, well, I mean, so first of all, does it make sense on the face of it that the people that operated the largest, most brutal slave trade in human history would also be the authors of freedom? Does that does that pass the smell test, or does that, uh, cause us to question, the moral investment that they have in reproducing that narrative? So the first historian to kind of systematically debunk this was a Caribbean historian of African descent, Eric Williams, in his classic Capitalism and Slavery. And he makes the argument essentially that the form of um, mercantile enslavement that had produced the wealth of Britain throughout the 18th century was now inhibiting the growth of an industrial economy in England, and so he sees this as a conflict inside of capitalism. I think that what my contemporary colleague at Harvard University, Vincent Brown, who's written on Tacky's revolt, a Jamaican uprising, Caribbean uprising of the enslaved, would add to this is that what really drives the British towards abolition, it is the fact that the enslaved resist on massive scale and make slavery increasingly expensive over the course of the 18th century. There are large scale organized slave rebellions that make the military expenditure and the kind of systematic repression and violence that is needed in order to keep the system going. That provides a particular kind of pressure from one side. Now, there is a morally rooted critique of slavery that emerges in Britain specifically, that leads to a kind of liberal, argument for abolition of the institution. But even that is not the thing that people think that it is. So that is usually associated with William Wilberforce, who is the person who makes the case most effectively and in an impassioned way to the British Parliament, leading alongside these economic pressures, the kind of two different economic pressures that I just sketched, the one from Eric Williams and the other from the violence of the armed resistance to the enslaved. Those things come together, leading to the 1807 abolition of the international trade by Britain. But that person, Wilberforce, is actually the student of the first great British abolitionist, a person called the Reverend Thomas Clarkson. And the Reverend Thomas Clarkson in 1789 writes a treatise called Letters on the Slave Trade, where he details the abolitionist movement led by African Muslims in the Senegal River Valley beginning in the 1770s. And he says that this is his inspiration for making an abolitionist argument. And he says of the leader of an African Muslim anti-slavery movement in the Senegal River Valley, a person called Abdul Qadir Khan, who is known in the sources from that time just as Al-Mami Abdul Qadir. Al-Mami is the Fulani rendering of El-Imam. He is not a king. He is an elected leader that can be deposed through representative democratic institutions. And this person, Abdul Qadir Khan, Al-Mami Abdul Qadir, is described in Clarkson's Letters on the Slave Trade. He said that this wise and virtuous man has done more for the causes of humanity, justice, liberty, and religion than any of the sovereigns of Europe. He actually uses about 25% of the page count in his first treatise on the abolition of the slave trade, describing an African Muslim abolitionist movement that precedes him by a generation. And he's not um, uh, this is not a fictionalized account. Clarkson has actually sat down with slave ship captains that have been coming back from Senegal and interviewed them. He does an interview with a French botanist that speaks fluent Wolof and lived on the mainland for years. He constructs this detailed history of an abolitionist movement. And I write about that abolitionist movement in my first book, The Walking Quran. But I also make the point that going back to the time of Afonso in the 1520s, and for all of those hundreds of years between them, and even in the time after Abdul Qadir Khan, there are Africans that are striving to abolish the slave trade. The Africans are trying to opt out of the system time and time again. As long as the demand for enslaved Africans is this principal motor in the global economy, and as long as Europeans are willing to assassinate anyone who will not comply with this order. Here's what Clarkson says. Clarkson says, if you study European intervention in Africa in the era of the slave trade, he says you will find that their method is to, through schemes of bribery and intoxication, transform African kings from shepherds to wolves amongst their people. That there's this systematic effort to cultivate trading partners that will give the Europeans what they want. And of course, time and time again, when African abolitionist movements rise, they are brutally put down by European force and often by political assassinations. The leaders of these African abolitionist movements almost all die as martyrs.
Okay, so I want to kind of start speaking because a lot of what you're saying is quoting scholars who are from Harvard and other places, and as we know, there's a massive crackdown right now on universities and university. So we want to kind of speak to that and sort of the death of memory, bearing in mind that this is not a new thing, right? That it took a long while for this kind of scholarship to emerge out of these institutions. But before we go there, you mentioned Gaza, and you mentioned that we can't imagine this until we are now seeing. I mean, there's obviously been many other wars, including World War II and the Vietnam War and the Korean War and the Gulf War, where there was mass casualties. But yes, the sort of the vivid images we're seeing is probably unprecedented. But it's interesting that there was so much brutality that they was willing to exercise so that they could commodify human beings. And now the world is kind of almost fine witnessing so much brutality. And it's not really to commodify human beings. It's more like, I don't know what it's called, to settle the anxiousness of a settler colonial entity. How does that dehumanization sort of transfer? And I'm also seeing parallels between how the Europeans wanted to cultivate sort of puppet regimes in Africa, and how the same thing has happened with Arab regimes, or not just Arab regimes. Just speak a bit to that, and how these things have sort of how has it been? I mean, I guess it. Just what's your comments on how through all the generations we have these patterns revealing itself? What does it say about the war in Gaza and both the Democrat and Republican response to it?
So, I mean, I would start with the man over my shoulder in more ways than one. I would start with El-Hajj Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X. And Malcolm, and this is material that comes up in the brilliant doctoral dissertation of Maitha El-Hassan, who went through all of Malcolm's field journals and his travel notes. And Malcolm, after, I believe it's right after he visited Khan Yunis, Malcolm writes in his field journals that, and he's talking about the Zionist occupation, so-called Israel. He says that this is a white Jewish population being given land by white imperialist powers and moving brown Arabs out of their homes. So Malcolm understood in 1964 that what he was looking at in Palestine was just another iteration of white supremacy. He understood that the appropriate framework for reading the Zionist settler colony was against this longer history of European settler colonialism. And that allows me to answer your question in the following way. I talked a lot about capitalism and the rise of slavery as an economic system and a system of exploitation and the destabilization that it needs to thrive. But tethered to that, it wasn't just a racialization of Black people, although Black people were put at the bottom of those white supremacist racial hierarchies in every instance. It was also the elaboration of a broader white supremacy that also meant dominion over Asiatics and Arabs and and indigenous North American populations, every single part of the human family in a white supremacist framing becomes subhuman, less than. And when that's the case, even if you are not trying to commoditize their labor, um, whatever they possess that you want, you just take because they are not people the way that you're people. The way that the Dutch settlers in what becomes South Africa framed this was that they referred to the indigenous population as schepsels and they referred to themselves as menscha. This is the difference between creatures and people. So, whatever is in the earth, whatever natural gas is off the coast of Gaza, see, the thing is that eventually it's just a matter of time before the Skepsels have something that you want. And the fact that you can deem them subhuman and therefore steal from them without compunction, kill them without second thought or moral tremor in your soul, right? That you just do it and don't feel anything about it except perhaps satisfaction. That is ingrained in white supremacist structures themselves. So the settler colonialism that we see in Palestine is the same settler colonialism that was unleashed on the indigenous population of South Africa or on the indigenous population of North America, and it rested on white supremacy. You know, the last thing that I'll say, and just to allow you to come circle back to so that I can better answer your question, is that the real superpower that Europeans have um, over those 4 centuries of the kind of rise of the slave trade, and now we can extend it another 5 centuries of European, global imperialism. By the way, which is in its dying day, right? This is the we're witnessing the extinction burst of the Zionist entity, and we're witnessing the extinction burst of American empire. White supremacist empire is finished. Um, but what marked the 5 centuries of white supremacist empire was not technological superiority, because at the outset of that period, the Europeans weren't even the best gun manufacturers in the world. The Chinese or the Ottomans were. It wasn't a superior form of social organization. Literacy rates were much higher in Senegambia than they were amongst the people that were enslaving Senegambians, to the point that there are many records of African Muslims enslaved in the Americas keeping their plantation records for their masters, because the enslaved Muslims were literate in multiple languages and their masters couldn't read any. So it's not a superior civilization. It's not even superior force of arms. The magic formula is white supremacy. The magic formula is believing that the people around you aren't people the way that you're people, and therefore you can do whatever you want to them. And that has always meant inflicting massive casualties on women and children in order to break down political systems. When you study the systematic killing of non-combatants, of women and children in Gaza and in Palestine more broadly, this was a routine tactic in the conquest of the West in the United States. It was a routine tactic in the expansion of settler colonialism in South Africa. And they're always able to do it because these are not people the same way that we are people.
Just to sort of I mean, it's fascinating. Just I mean that last bit especially about how this violence on women and children is kind of like a driving force to incentivize it. Now, just to clarify, yes, at the genesis of it, these are societies that don't have the level of sophistication, but obviously after legacies of slavery, after legacies of being able to be brutal. By, of course, the 19th, 20th century, they have atom bombs and they have the biggest and most advanced militaries, and they're still using that in a violent way. And I think it's interesting. And now I want to come back to sort of college campuses. And when we spoke a year ago, it was already, Biden had already signed the $18 billion arms transfer to Netanyahu. There was already talk about ethnically cleansing Gaza. It was already clear that Gaza was going to be completely obliterated. And already by then, the death toll was almost as high as it is now. Obviously, it's been still a devastating year. But even then, we could not have imagined that a president of the USA would just ignore the ruling of 9 Supreme Court judges, who majority of which he's appointed, or at least has been appointed by his party. Even then, we may not have been able to imagine that people who are honestly probably the milder demonstrators in terms of the pro-Palestinian movement are being deported, are being ruled as they should be deported by judges, and are being locked up. And it's interesting, again, that it's not white people that's being locked up, although there are many white people who are protesting and are pro-Palestinian and and it's interesting because these are obviously some of the mildest protesters. When you look at their rhetoric, it's completely universal. It's very inclusive, adamantly against anti-Semitism, and also unapologetically pro-Palestinian.
Rumesa didn't even actually, make statements about Palestinian liberation as such. All she said was that the university should abide by its own rules regarding protests. So, I mean, to underline your point, like these are the mildest of all possible interventions.
But I mean, the parallel I want to draw is that the moral and communal fiber of the people that are being brutalized, both in Gaza and on US campuses, is just so much more sophisticated than their brutalizers, who are just, who have an imagined morality and are extremely brutal. And you can see that pattern. I mean, the discourse, the level of, hey, we should try to create senses of community. We should, be together. Inclusivity, pluralism is just so much more. I mean, they're just much more sophisticated. And you can see, you can actually see how the superpower that they have, the magic formula, is the fact that they got the guns and they're willing to use them and they're willing to use force. They're willing to defy their own institutions. And it's remarkable how it just translates. And it's just so direct.
And I'll just say this, as a black man, having this discourse about the nakedness of white supremacist brutality be reduced to a conversation about fascism, I have to admit that I find this a bit galling, insofar as M.A. Césaire, the great Caribbean, African descendant intellectual, put it, and then Frantz Fanon, put his writings to good work as well. Aimé Césaire said that what fascism was, what Nazism was the extension to white people um, of all of the kinds of forms of violence and brutality and control that had always been extended to the colonial world. This is where the concept of imperial boomerang comes from, right? Whatever the empire does to them out there, it will eventually be unleashed on the us in here. So all we are seeing, to paraphrase Malcolm, and Malcolm said this after JFK was assassinated in 1963, Malcolm said that this is America's chickens coming home to roost. You can't sow violence all out in the world and expect the violence not to find you here at home. So what we are just now finding is that, and this generation is learning it, previous generations have learned it, it's being demonstrated perhaps more dramatically than some of us expected. Although Black folk are not surprised by this. I'm just going to be honest about this, is that we've seen, the Trumps of the world before. We've come to know them up close and personal. It's just that now these violations of the articulated principles of American liberty and democracy are being flagrantly violated, not just for Black and Indigenous people. That those things are now starting to be, tested out on broader segments of the population. The autocratic genocidal impulse that white supremacy has visited upon Black and Indigenous bodies for centuries is now being extended more widely in the body politic. And by the way, this is also a consistent pattern that, people forget, dear God, people forget that the the majority of the Jews that were um, horrifically slaughtered at Auschwitz were killed in the last few months of the war, after the outcome of the war had already been decided. That when these white supremacist empires or aspirant empires are in their death throes, they begin to flail wildly, and to destroy or seek to harm everything in sight. And I think that that's what we're seeing. We are witnessing the collapse of the American empire. And so there's this intensification of its most brutal face. But for those of us that, have had the fortune and misfortune of being born Black in the United States of America, nothing that white supremacy does is ever going to surprise me. And I never bet against white supremacy in the United States of America. I remember back in 2016, people were like, "Oh, Trump can't win." I was like, "Huh." How quaint that you would think that. And it's because it is so deeply rooted in the nature of the American polity, that it's had this foundation in the genocide of indigenous populations and the massive exploitation of an enslaved African population, and that's its true face. And it has this other face, which is a beautiful and admirable discourse on self-determination and governance and individual rights and democratic institutions. But the thing is that those were never extended to all of the people of the United States of America. So when they are stripped from some people, that's not a surprise to those of us that have been watching this story unfold from the sharp end of the sword for centuries.
I mean, I just want to build a bit on that and then ask a question. And I mean, the question is going to be about sort of there is this kind of euphoria among Democrats or people who believe there's this new spike of fascism, and in their minds this is unprecedented what Donald Trump is, and to some extent it absolutely is, especially in terms of, I mean, maybe it isn't, who knows, right? But there's this euphoria.
Andrew Jackson openly defied Supreme Court orders for white supremacist reasons too. I mean, for the record,
Yeah, yeah. No,
not.
no.
Yeah.
Like I'm saying, like, it is, but it isn't, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, when you mentioned World War II, there was a Nazi party in the UK and there was a Nazi party in the USA well before World War II, and remnants of it continue to this day. It was just 60 years ago that we're in the heights of the civil rights movement, and I mean, just yesterday there was probably, there's definitely a black man in America who was worried for their life because a cop stopped them, and it was just 5 years ago or 6 years ago in the heights of COVID when we had this massive BLM movement and everything else. So I mean, it's very, very recent, right? So it's what is the cause then for this sort of liberal amnesia? You've talked about it. You've talked about how, but like just what's going on there.
Yeah, liberal amnesia is a beautiful term. So, looking at Malcolm again over my shoulder, I think it's in 1964 that Malcolm says the white liberal is the most dangerous thing in the Western Hemisphere. And Malcolm says this at a time when white conservatives are hanging from trees, turning dogs and fire hoses on black protesters, and shooting white civil rights voting activists in the head and burying them in shallow graves along the side of the road. And it's still Malcolm's estimation that the more dangerous of the two predators is not the conservative wolf, as he puts it, whose mouth is fixed into a snarl that leaves you with no illusion as to where you stand, but it is with the liberal fox who smiles, or you think that it's a smile, but they're really baring their teeth because they're getting ready to eat too. So the problem, and by the way, this has been the unanimous diagnosis of all of the Black revolutionary traditions, is that, and Kwame Ture put it this way. He said, when the final confrontation comes, he said, the liberal will for sure be on the side of the oppressor. So inside liberalism, liberalism and conservatism have functioned, as um, counterweights inside a single white supremacist, capitalist, European imperial civilization. Liberals did not protest the slave trade. Liberals did not protest European colonization in Africa and the massive slaughter that entailed from that. Liberals are always concerned, about moral wrongs that were done in the past, never concerned about the moral wrongs that are ongoing and current in the present moment. And it's very difficult for liberalism to understand that white supremacy is embedded in liberalism too. So this is, a fundamental issue with where we are now, is that many people are just now understanding through the Gaza genocide, when they see an ostensibly liberal Democratic Party engaged in some of the most heinous, horrific, and brutal acts in the history of white supremacy. They're just now understanding this fundamental problem that has always been embedded in liberalism. And Malcolm, again, talked about this as kind of being uh, something that he was speaking to the Black community, but now I'm speaking just generally to the American body politic. You have to be able to take a realistic assessment of what you're dealing with when you're dealing with this ostensibly liberal party that is represented by the Democrats. Malcolm said in 1964 to the Black community, he said, you put them first and they put you last, and that makes you a chump. It makes you a political chump. That people have been engaged in entertaining this discourse that this ostensibly liberal party was actually about some kind of emancipation for oppressed communities of color. But the wealth gap between black and white expanded more in the Biden years than it did in the last, Trump presidency. The dependency politics of the Democratic Party have not been emancipatory for black people. So Malcolm's answer in the Ballad of the Bullet, the speech he gave in 1964 in a few different venues, similar theme, and he took them in slightly different directions each time. But what he said in one of them is, he said that I'm going door to door, every door in Harlem, and we are going to register every Black person behind every door, not as a Democrat or as a Republican, but as an independent. He wanted independence from what we now think of as the duopoly, which, if anything, is more obviously corrupt and more obviously in collusion than previously, right? Now, the Democrats and Republicans, their donor base is almost, a Venn diagram with two overlapping circles. It is APAC, it is Raytheon, it is Lockheed Martin, it is Boeing, it is General Dynamics. They are all funded by settler colonialism and warmongering, literally the same forces of destabilization that we were talking about in the beginning of this talk. Those are the things that have been used to destabilize and extract resources from Iraq and from Afghanistan. And now they got their eyes on Iran. The modality hasn't changed. So what we need to do from here inside the belly of the beast is to detach from these two parties, which have been, this has been a mask off moment, right? For both Democrats and Republicans, for both Team Blue and Team Red, people are now seeing the depths of moral depravity of which these two parties are capable, and the thinly veiled veneer of civility that lies on top of continued imperialism, continued white supremacist violence. The last thing I'll say, just to go back to one piece of what you offered, is that I'm actually hopeful despite the darkness of the hour, because I witnessed in those 2020 Floyd uprisings something that I had never seen before. The whole world came out, in Palestine and in France and in Asia, everywhere. People stood up, understanding and appreciating the kind of brutality that was being visited upon Black folks. I've been marching against police brutality since I was 13 years old. First time I ever saw more white protesters than Black protesters. Amazing moment and a mobilization. Similarly, with the Free Palestine movement that has emerged, you have seen the narrative control of Zionism fall utterly. You are now also seeing like massive mobilizations around stopping the impositions of ICE, protecting immigrants, abolishing ICE. Um, and and I'm hopeful that we can translate those mobilizations into organizations. The last thing that I'll say is another student of Malcolm, one that knew him in life as I did not, Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael, said revolutionaries don't just mobilize around issues, revolutionaries organize against systems. So we've had these mobilizations around these specific issues. The reason why I accepted the invitation into electoral politics was I believe that political party organizing is needed in order to help move the masses from mobilization around these specific issues to organization against the systems that produce all of these related forms of state violence.
You mentioned, I mean, in your very long response, which is, I thank
Sorry
you
for
for.
that.
No, I thank you. I thank you for it. I wasn't saying it as kind of like a.
University office, so I
Yeah,
will get.
no. Look, I mean, it's. I didn't mean it at all as a sort of castigation at all. I was just literally describing it. But it's because I'm going back to a point you made quite a long time ago. But you mentioned sort of there's like this. That there's been some illumination that the Democrats and the Republicans were bad in Gaza, but it's almost like amnesia. It's like people forget the destruction that was wrought under Biden. That he really, I mean, we don't know what Trump would have done if he was in charge of October 7th, but we do know what Biden did. And that record speaks for itself. And even State Department officials have come out and said, even the Israelis were surprised, that this was allowed to go on for as long as they'd had. They thought it'd be 2 months or 3 months. And so that's why the bombardment was so hectic. And he just kept on sending guns and money. And it was very clear that this was going to be his posture from very early on. I think if people sort of had a sense of what colonialism and white supremacy is, and I think that is why it was so heartbreaking. It's because you could see it about to unfold, and it like every single sentiment or sentence that was said from anyone in power, even if it was kind words, was clear that this is just more carte blanche. And now it's almost like Trump releasing a silly video or saying a few stupid things evokes more outrage, and it's just quite indicative. You talked about the need for organizing, and we're gonna start speaking about that. But before that, before I even get to that, before we get into your, I want to ask you what it was like, sort of running in the election, and we're gonna get to being the governor of California. But before we even get there, what's your vision for how you kind of fix America?
I have this uh, remnant of a childhood dream, right? So I grew up in extreme poverty in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., a few miles from the centers of imperial power, in the shadow of the Washington Monument, in the shadow of the Capitol. But I could not have possibly been further away. Like, my father had a sixth grade education, and he was a locksmith who made ends meet by hustling on the side. My mom was 15 years old, pregnant with me, and told by her high school guidance counselor to get an abortion because she was pregnant by a black man. I grew up in an America that was deeply polarized, but still had this idea that this place could actually serve all of its people. It was very unusual back then to try to sustain the narrative that is now sometimes sustained by conservatives, but that the principal victims of racism in America are white people. Across the political spectrum, it was widely understood that massive amounts of trauma and harm had been inflicted upon Black people and upon Native Americans, and that there was this aspirational goal that with those ideals encoded in those foundational documents, like the Declaration of Independence, which does not say we the corporations, it says we the people, right? And it's about bringing forth a form of representative governance, and that should be something that's eventually extended to all people. Yes, it has been brutal in the past. Yes, it has been violated, more than it has been honored, but those principles were a thing that were worth striving for. I actually believe, still at the core of my being, and having lived now in Washington, D.C., and Minneapolis, and Michigan, and California, and Chicago, and with relatives from the deep South, where I spent a lot of time, Georgia, I actually still, believe it or not, in spite of myself, believe that there is something fundamentally redeemable in the hearts of the American population as a whole. I believe that. And I believe that can be appealed to. I think that in this last electoral cycle, there were probably something like 15 million regular Democratic voters that could not hold their nose and vote for a genocider. And I think that that's actually a profound statement that the United States has not suffered absolute moral death yet. I think that there was a similar number, 15 million or so, that did hold their nose and vote for Trump. But if given an alternative to a corrupt, genocidal Democratic Party that was not tainted with overt white supremacism, fascism, and autocracy, that a lot of those Republican voters would be gettable voters. And I believe that the biggest single political group in the United States of America, and the electoral results bear this out, is the group of people that think that neither of those two parties is worth voting for. The 90 million, eligible Americans did not vote, and the reason is that they're being given two corrupt, murderous alternatives who are in the employ of corporations and who do nothing to serve the people. And I think that there is actually still an argument that can be made to the American people writ large that government actually can be made to serve all of the people. And I believe that if we can wrest control in one electoral cycle through one simple mechanism, which is getting the corporate money out of the political system, if we can get to publicly financed elections, or at least to campaign finance reform, I think an entirely new political um, arena is actually going to be opened up in the United States of America as soon as the corporations are no longer able to exert mind control through media mechanisms and political control through buying of elections. And I think that argument is going to resonate with a lot of people in different places on ideological and political spectrums.
So I hear what you're saying, especially about the big chunk of Americans who just didn't vote, and some. I mean, there's many reasons why they wouldn't, and about many people being disillusioned and that the choices in front of them is not great. But I mean, I don't think you or Jill could have been too happy with the conversion rate, right, of converting those people into actual Green Party votes. What's your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, so my personal response to that is that I was called onto the campaign, as you know, in mid-August. I had 75 days to make a case to the American people, and we had less than no resources to do it. When I joined that campaign, the Green Party presidential campaign, Dr. Stein's campaign, had raised roughly $1 million in the 10 months that preceded me joining the campaign. In the 2 months, 2.5 months that I was on the campaign, we raised more than twice that, 2.5 times that. And the reason was that we were able to deliver clear, targeted messaging to the Muslim community that we were not for sale on Gaza, and that with our limited resources, we were actually able to effectively turn a significant portion of the American electorate, and that's the Muslim community. The Muslim community, according to the exit polling, scientific exit polling, 53% of the American Muslim community voted for the Steinway ticket in the 2024 election, 21% for Trump, 20% for Kamala, the rest split between other third parties. So while our overall electoral results, I was disappointed by them. I also had 2.5 months to contribute to the outcome, and I didn't have more than that. I did the best that I could. But I do think that that's part of the reason why running for governor in the state of California, I'm beginning my campaign early, building organizational infrastructure from the ground up, because I know that with targeted messaging to specific communities about practical resolutions to the issues that are of most direct concern to that community, we can flip a population. The Muslims had voted basically two-thirds Democrat for the last 60 years in presidential elections. And in one electoral cycle, not only did we flip the Muslim community, which is 2.5 million, registered voters, we flipped the Muslim community from Democrat but not to the other dominant party. And people have not, this is something that's not covered in the news. I mean, think about what it means to take any demographic and get them to opt out of the duopoly entirely. So then what happens when I have 15 months of targeted messaging and community building in the Black community on a Black liberation message that's rooted in Malcolm? What about one on immigrants' rights and the abolition of ICE, and running as a governor in the state of California that is not going to comply with any unconstitutional demands? The feds are going to have to come through every lawyer in the state of California before they lay a single hand on a single hair on the single head of any California resident, right? So that is an argument that is going to cause, especially the Latino community, to pay attention to what this campaign is doing. And we are running as a, a defending the rights of the working class, defending the middle class against capitalist corporate exploitation. We have seen how the American general populace feels about the current corporate run environment in their response to the debraining of the United Healthcare executive Brian Thompson. Like, we know that running on universal healthcare, single payer healthcare in the state of California is a winning proposition, because we know nationwide people want universal healthcare. So I think that there's actually um, signs of an effective strategy for intervention in electoral politics, but it is going to require a lot of work. And it is also going to require, like, getting people to unplug from the media programming that says that you only have these two football teams to choose from and they're engaged in an eternal tug of war. I also know it can win because I've seen it happen. I was, I grew up partially in Minneapolis. Jesse Ventura in 1998 ran as a third party candidate, and shocked everyone by knocking the two parties out of the governor's mansion. And I'm absolutely convinced that with effective fundraising in the Muslim community and organizing in working class communities of different colors across this state, we can absolutely do the same thing.
I want to throw sort of two questions at you now at the same time, right? Just because I think it's important that you know the follow up, like as you're
Okay.
answering the first one, right? So the first one is sort of just how's the campaign going in terms of campaign finance? How far out is the election? The competition? What are your sort of expectations from the election? But then the second thing is there's this innate thing which you probably don't like, just reflecting on your personality, which I don't know. I mean, I only know from interacting with our brief interactions we've had. But there's this innate thing about US politics that's, self promotion. It's about branding. And you've built a career based on sort of speaking the truth, trying to understand the truth, being a critical thinker, being a voice outside of the system. Don't you think that, like, it's how are you managing sort of that conflict between the nature of democratic politics, especially in the US, and not just in the US, but especially in the US, where it's very self-promotional, very self-aggrandizement, all about branding, and not often about substance. And aren't you maybe hampering your ability to be a clear voice on the outside by doing that?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll go in reverse order, of the questions. I think that the first thing that I will say is that I remain profoundly skeptical and in a posture of distrust regarding electoral politics. And I think that that's a good thing. I think that having questions about the deficiencies that are built into the system is one of the things that actually has always made me an effective instrument for change inside systems. I never accept the givens as given. I always take them as constructions. And therefore, I have a lot of questions about electoral politics. Malcolm over my shoulder is one of the things that allowed me to overcome that. Malcolm, before he was taken from us, was talking about the ballot or the bullet, and he was openly advocating for the use of electoral political tools to help drive the aims of liberation. And Malcolm was doing that without any kind of, chain on his tongue. He stayed Malcolm and he was still speaking truth and spitting facts uncensored. And the one thing that you can know for sure is that I'm not going to stop doing that. Another brother in the UK, our good brother Amir Rahman, the comedian, we did an Instagram live, and he was like, "Yeah, I didn't know what to think. When you, I thought that they, like you might." Be calmed down or tamed, when you started getting into politics. And he was like, "You're like, louder and crazier than ever, basically." And I'm like, "Yeah, because what's needed in times like this is truth." One of the big, and this connects to the first question that you asked about how's the campaign going. One of the very well-to-do Muslim donors that supported both the presidential run and now the gubernatorial campaign, I asked him, I was like, doesn't some of this like revolutionary talk like scare people like you that are invested, in different ways in the system? And this particular individual said to me, not at all. um, he said that ruling classes always underestimate how close the people are to revolution when wealth inequalities reach the scale that they currently are. He said only people that are speaking the unvarnished truth are reliable in moments like these. So I'm not going to change that modality. I'm not going to become somebody that performs politics. The way that my wife put it, she said, the thing that you've got going for you is that you're sort of the anti Trump. You're also not a politician. You're also someone who does not pull any punches and who is not afraid to be authentically themselves. Then she said, Trump is stupid. You're smart. Trump is immoral. You're very pious. And people are going to see that contrast between someone who is authentically rooted in public service and people who are authentically rooted in self-interest. And then that brings to where the campaign is. Um, we have had, I lost count when we got past 350 or so volunteers in the first 2 months of the campaign. So we officially opened the campaign website on February 1st. That's the first that donations were able to be accepted, and also where we began accepting volunteers. So I think we're up over 500 volunteers now, building that infrastructure and that ground structure. The majority of our donors are coming, it's basically about a 50-50 split, coming from inside the state of California, the small donors coming from inside the state of California and from all around the country. Um, you know, Hundreds and hundreds of people from all over the place are seeing the intervention that we're making in California politics as the tip of the spear of a political revolution. That this in 2026 is the best way that we can build third party power. Um, the fundraising has also been, profoundly successful, just because we've had heavyweights in the Muslim community that have been willing to make maximum campaign donations. 36,000 is the maximum individual donation to the campaign, in contradistinction to 3,300 for the presidential. And so without taking a penny of corporate money, and I will never take a penny of corporate money, we've been able to raise significant funds to be able to get this moving, and that's still 14 months out from the primary. That's the last part that I'll say, is that the whole election, and especially for American viewers and listeners, lodge this in your head: the whole election is going to take place on June 2nd, 2026. The general election is in November, but the primary is on June 2nd, 2026. And this is one of those primaries where the two parties have sought to conspire to make it so that only they can advance, only the top two candidates advance, irrespective of party. That's designed to produce a Democrat versus a Republican, but it's going to backfire in the state of California, where we have as many registered independents as we have registered Republicans. The state leans liberal/progressive enough that it tips the balance in that direction. If we are able to finish second in that primary, then whoever the Democrats trot out is going to have to deal with me on a debate stage for 5 months. And that's the end of the duopoly, because they are incapable of keeping any of their promises. I will rip the veneer off of their fake opposition to Trump, and especially if the rumors are true and Kamala is going to to run in the state of California, because no one is exposed on the issues of most fundamental concern than she is. No one's more exposed on the genocide in Gaza. No one's more exposed on being an agent of the carceral state. No one's more exposed on being a shill for the corporate wing of the Democratic Party than she is. And we've already seen the so-called progressives like Katie Porter, who's in the race, say that if Kamala were to enter the field, that she would likely clear the field, which means that, as usual, the progressive wing of the Democrat Party is just playing the role of trying to keep progressives engaged so they can hand off the voters to the genocidal lunatics in the pantsuits, right? That's their job. That's why Bernie and AOC are touring the country now, is because they're doing everything they can to try to keep people from running to an actual independent third party alternative.
I have some conclusion questions, but I just want to sort of circle back to some of the things we said earlier on. We spoke about Trump's, and it was not just Trump, it was under the Democrats and Biden as well, but the suppression of campus free speech. There's an attack on universities and the independence of universities. There's deportations. And you also mentioned that you seeing a massive change in the narrative in terms of young Americans and how they think about the Gaza conflict, how they think about AIPAC. Just talk about that. Do you think, in a way, this draconian measures from Trump, is it going to be a boomerang? Is it actually just fueling more resentment and more sort of distrust in the common narrative, or do you think it is there has to be an element which is damaging Just what's your thoughts on that?
So it's profoundly damaging. Um, it is an escalation in the visibility of the repression. The principal difference is that Democrats like to hide when they're doing fascist things, and Republicans like to advertise when they're doing fascist things. You know, numbers just came out that with all of the theatrics, Trump has deported fewer people in the first 3 months of 2025 than Biden did in the first 3 months of 2024, right? So that there is there's something that is being unmasked and becoming more publicly visible, and I think that that is provoking resistance. Having said that, um, Trump is an incredibly insecure, small, pathetic um, narcissist who will use the United States government and its full power for personal, capricious, whimsical aims. So there's no doubt that he is going to do destabilizing damage that um, the Democrats would have done more disciplined damage. It would probably be more sustainable in the long term. I think that Trump is going to provoke resistance that is more visible, and that's always the case, right? Unfortunately, liberals have been willing to rubber stamp genocide as long as there was a blue jersey in the White House at the time. At least now they have the good sense to try to resist it, even if their resistance is opportunistic. So I think that what's going to happen is that we are going to see, hopefully, an escalation in the resistance and the response to the repression. But sadly, I do think that things are going to get better, or sorry, get worse before they get better. And the reason is the Democrats are incapable of offering any substantive resistance.
You teach at a university,
I do.
just and obviously you probably have colleagues and friends across many universities. Just
I do.
what's the sense like? Is there a sense that is there a culpable sense of our freedom to teach is being sort of harmed, or what's the feeling
Yeah,
there?
I mean, absolutely. Everyone is aware, that uh, we are seeing massive repression of speech and even our ability to teach, right? Our students are, we're getting directives from university, like University of California, Santa Barbara, basically just said, distribute know your rights cards to your students, but we're not going to do anything to keep ICE from coming and ripping students off of, campus. And similar, edicts have gone forth, from a number of different university offices across the country. Let me be clear, the corporate takeover of the American university is completed in this moment. This has been prepared for a long time, and universities now essentially, function like corporations. The board of regents are not democratic institutions. Oftentimes, Zionist donors, have outsized influence. We have a new campus anti-Semitism task force. There is no anti-Semitism in any of the pro-Palestinian demonstrations that have been taking place on this campus for the last 20 months. So we see the response of academic institutions writ large to the Trump federal overreach has been the response of the Vichy regime in France to the Nazis. They were like, "Oui, commandant, how can I help?" And that is to the everlasting shame of these institutions that call themselves places of higher education. I don't think that American universities will ever recover from the stain that they are bathing themselves in, because historians are going to write about the genocide in Gaza as the pivotal, defining political moment of the early 21st century, the way that they write about the Holocaust as the pivotal, defining political moment of the first half of the 20th century. So everyone that is on the wrong side of this is cursed and doomed. not just by the God that you and I believe is watching and judging, but by the tablets of history which are recording it all.
I mean, I just coming. I mean, specifically, I want to speak now about Columbia and Harvard, and you may not have enough information about either of those institutions, because I respect that, because I mean, I mean, you may surprise us, but just with the Columbia thing, I mean, I remember speaking to a friend about this, and he mentioned that they capitulated to Trump's requests, and I just smirked and I said, I don't think it was a capitulation. I think it's an agreement. I think Columbia have been trying to shut down the Edward Said fraternity and everything that came out of that for a long time, and this was just a great opportunity for them to do that. Just your comments on that. I mean, you kind of did this already, but Harvard's taken a different route. They've just written a press release and they've told Trump, you are not going to interfere, and we don't care if we lose the federal funding. Now it's different because Harvard does have a lot of money, and Harvard also is very much a corporate institution. Just what's your interpretations of that?
Well, in the Harvard, so I have close friends and colleagues at Harvard University. Vince Brown, who I just mentioned before, has been one of the faculty members that has written op-eds and has been involved in that resistance. I think that what has taken place at Harvard is that the faculty themselves were able to effectively organize and really, make their voices heard. And I think that there's hope in that. I don't know that Harvard is redeemable. I don't know that the Ivy League is redeemable, but I think that the good fight from the faculty um, is salutary. It's a positive development. I will point out, however, that North American universities are bastions of liberalism. And it would have been great to see those same kind of faculty alliances arrayed against the genocidal Democratic state under Biden. And we didn't see that same kind of coordinated faculty resistance. For the most part, I felt like students were leading the way and faculty members who were willing to stick their necks out, like myself. And the Zionists came for me, as you know, in November of 2023, after I did Black and Palestinian solidarity events and a march across campus and other things. I've been disappointed, frankly, by the fact that tenured faculty have not been willing to stand up and leverage their positions inside these institutions to offer a more robust resistance. And the reason I think it goes back to what you said is that they didn't fight back because they agreed, right? That these universities that have rolled over on DEI, for the most part, have been doing performative only DEI for the last 2 decades anyway. They never really cared about serving diverse communities of students. They never protected Black students on campus. I mean, the audacity of having special commissions for anti-Semitism, because people don't feel safe on campus. I'm 51 years old, have a PhD. I still don't feel safe on any university campus. When I come onto campus in a sweatshirt, I've been stopped and trying to get into my own office. So why do some people get, protection on these campuses and others don't? It's the same reason why the resistance was not forthcoming, because the liberalism has also had the poison in it. Last thing that I'll say to end with a word of hope on this is that this generation of students is built different. I've never seen a generation more politically engaged, politically astute. When I was talking anti capitalism 20 years ago at the beginning of my career, 5% of the students could hear me. Now that number is 60% easy. When we were talking about, free Palestine 20 years ago, it had to be in whispered and hushed tones. Now they're shouting it from the rooftops. This is a generation that is no longer getting the principal source of its information from corporate controlled media, and therefore they're ready to take matters into their own hands because they have formed their own independent understandings of imperialism and capitalism and white supremacy. And I'm hopeful, that with some political leadership, some intellectual leadership, that this generation can get the kind of divestment movement that was successful in with respect to South Africa, can get the kind of anti-war movement that was successful in getting the U.S. out of Vietnam. But those were protracted, lengthy struggles. We can't just think that we're going to throw our jersey on the field and the other team is going to go home. Like, we have to go out and play the game to win.
Okay, final question, and it's actually just it's an open-ended question. Is there anything that in the course of this discussion that you think we haven't covered, and you just want to mention or say or point out?
Yeah, I think that what I would say is that the there is a unique opportunity for um, an effective third party to rise in this moment, because 63% of Americans, according to polling, will literally say that the Democrats and Republicans do such a poor job that we need an effective third party. That number rises to 70% if you're talking about independence. So I think that the increased concentration of wealth, I think that the visible face of fascism, the theatrics of repression, the overt attack on democratic norms, I think that all of this creates an opportunity for a new kind of political coalition to emerge. And even though, as you said at the outset of this, wasn't thinking anything about electoral politics, a year ago at all. And you can run tape on me from, community teaching and all of, academic work and organizing work over a couple of decades. You will never hear me talking about running for elected office. I think that the reason why I was called in to run for elected office is the same reason that Abdul Qadir Khan was called from his teaching Islamic law and Quranic sciences in the 1770s to lead an anti slavery revolution in the Senegal River Valley, to go back to where we started. I think that there's a particular moment that gives us an opportunity for a new kind of effective resistance. And once tagged into the fight, I'm going to stay until the fight is won. I think about what Malcolm would have done if he had lived. Was the United States ready for Malcolm to run as a vice president in 1964 or as a gubernatorial candidate? We'll never know. They took him from us. But I do believe that the Huey P. Newtons of the world who ran for Congress, the Fred Hamptons who did, grassroots organizing, I think that all of it has been preparation for a moment where the American people are going to have to rise up and resist and either bring forth the best in this place or watch the republic fall with its empire. And as somebody whose ancestors go centuries deep in this soil, not just my African American ancestors, but also my Seminole ancestors, I'm willing to fight for this place. I'm willing to fight to protect the rights of every single individual. And I do, as a person of faith, believe that like God has orchestrated this moment, and it has become part of my calling. And I'm going to try to take the lessons from those years of teaching and organizing and all of those historical figures in those books and try to apply it to helping to bring liberation, because I think that the United States government, as currently constituted, is the most dangerous instrument of surveillance and death dealing ever to exist in the history of humanity, and that the best way to make the world a better place would be to put the incredible vast resources of the United States of America in service of its people rather than in service of terrorizing the rest of humanity for the profit of a very few. And if this is the last chapter of my, career, I hope it's, a successful one, but either way, it's worth the fight.
Professor Rudolph Ware, also known as Butch Ware, thanks again for your time, and it was great speaking with you.
Pleasure was mine.
Thank you.